much, Chairman and Vice Chairman, members of the Commission. I thank you for undertaking this important work. I would just mention that General Myers and Paul Wolfowitz have been intimately involved in the work of the Department prior to September 11th, on September 11th, and subsequent to September 11th. First, let me express my condolences to the people of Spain. The March 11th bombings will leave that nation changed. Certainly the families that lost loved ones on September 11th, some of whom I'm sure are listening today, must feel a bond with the families in other countries who've lost their fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters to terrorism. They understand the pain and the heartbreak and the suffering of the families whose loved ones perished. The recent attacks are deadly reminders that the world's free nations are at war. I also want to thank the courageous men and women in uniform all across the globe who risked their lives so that all of us can live in freedom. This Commission has an important opportunity. Those in positions of responsibility in government are of necessity focused on dozens of issues. This Commission, however, can focus on one important topic, get it right, and provide insights that can be of great value to us. You've been asked to try to connect the dots after the fact, to examine events leading up to September 11th, and to consider what lessons, if any, might be taken from that experience that could prevent future dangers. It isn't an easy assignment, yet the challenge facing our country before September 11th, and still today, is even more difficult. Our task is to connect the dots not after the fact, but before the fact, to try to stop attacks before they happen. That must be done without the benefit of hindsight, hearings, briefings, or testimony. Another attack on our people will be attempted. We can't know where or when or by what technique. That reality drives those of us in government to ask the tough questions. When and how might that attack be attempted, and what will we need to have done today and every day before the attack to prepare for it and to, if possible, prevent it? On September 11th, our world changed. It may be tempting to think that once the crisis is past, that things will go back to the way they were. Not so. The world of September 10th is past. We've entered a new security environment, arguably the most dangerous the world has known, and if we're to continue to live as free people, we cannot go back to thinking as the way the world thought on September 10th. For if we deal with the problems of the 21st century through a 20th century prism, we will most certainly come to the wrong conclusions and fail the American people. I saw the destruction terrorists wreaked on September 11th. At the impact site, moments after the American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, one could see the flames, smell the burning fuel, see the twisted steel, and the agony of victims. And once the crisis passed, I asked the question posed to this Commission: what, if anything, might have been done to prevent it? First, I must say, I knew of no intelligence during the 6+ months leading up to September 11th that indicated terrorists would hijack commercial airliners, use them as missiles to fly into the Pentagon or the World Trade Center towers. The President set about forming what is today a 90-nation coalition to wage the global war on terrorist networks. He promptly set U.S. and coalition forces, air, sea, and ground, to attack Afghanistan, to overthrow the Taliban regime and destroy that al-Qaeda stronghold. In short order, the Taliban regime was driven from power. Al-Qaeda's sanctuary in Afghanistan was removed. Nearly 2/3 of their known leaders have been captured or killed. A transitional government is in power, and a clear message was sent: terrorists who harbor terrorists will pay a price. Those were bold steps, and today, in light of September 11th, no one questions those actions. Today, I suspect most would support a preemptive action to deal with such a threat. Interestingly, the remarkable military successes in Afghanistan is taken largely for granted, as is the achievement of bringing together a 90-nation coalition. But imagine that we were back before September 11th, and that a U.S. president had looked at the information then available, gone before the Congress and the world and said we need to invade Afghanistan, overthrow the Taliban, and destroy the al-Qaeda terrorist network, based on what little was known before September 11th. How many countries would have joined? Many? Any? Not likely. We would have heard objections to preemption similar to those voiced before the coalition launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. We would have been asked, how could you attack Afghanistan when it was al-Qaeda that attacked us, not the Taliban? How can you go to war when countries in the region don't support you? Won't launching such an invasion actually provoke terrorist attacks against the United States? I agree with those who have testified here today, Mrs. Albright, Secretary Cohen, and others, that unfortunately history shows that it can take a tragedy like September 11th to waken the world to new threats and to the need for action. We can't go back in time to stop the attack, but we all owe it to the families and the loved ones who died on September 11th to assure that their loss will, in fact, be the call that helps to ensure that thousands of other families do not suffer the pain they've endured. President Bush came to office with a determination to prepare for the new threats of the 21st century. The bombing of the Cole on October 12, 2000 was seen both as evidence of the al-Qaeda threat and the need to adjust U.S. policy. The more one studies terrorism, the more one becomes convinced that the approach to fighting it that had evolved over several decades really wasn't working. Treating terrorism as a matter of security, combating it through national and international law enforcement techniques, and taking defensive measures against terrorist attacks simply weren't enough. After the attack on the Marine barracks in Beirut, the first World Trade Center attack, the embassy bombings in East Africa, and the attack on the Cole, reasonable people have concluded that the value of that approach had diminished. A more comprehensive approach required a review not only of U.S. counterterrorism policy, but also U.S. policies with regard to other countries, some of which have not previously been at the center of U.S. relations, as Secretary Powell testified this morning. Dr. Rice has stated that she asked the National Security Council staff in her first week in office for a new presidential initiative on al-Qaeda. In early March, the staff was directed to craft a more aggressive strategy aimed at eliminating the al-Qaeda threat. The first draft of that approach in the form of a presidential directive was circulated by the NSC staff in June of 2001, and a number of meetings were held that summer at the Deputy Secretary level to address the policy questions involved, such as relating an aggressive strategy against Taliban to U.S.-Pakistan relations. By the first week of September, the process had arrived at a strategy that was presented to principals and later became NSPD-9, the President's first major substantive national security decision directive. It was presented for a decision by principals on September 4th, 2001, 7 days before the 11th, and later signed by the President with minor changes and a preamble to reflect the events of September 11th in October. While this review of counterterrorism policy was underway, the Department of Defense was developing a review of U.S. defense strategy. On February 2nd, less than 2 weeks after taking office, I traveled to Germany for the Conference on Security Policy. Already we were focused on the problem of unconventional or asymmetric threats. On the flight, I was asked about the principles that would drive our defense review. I answered that the 1991 Persian Gulf War had taught the world that taking on Western armies, navies, and air forces directly was not a good idea. It was therefore likely that potential adversaries would look for so-called asymmetrical responses, everything from terrorism, cyber attacks, to information warfare, cruise missiles and short-range ballistic missiles, to longer-range missiles and weapons of mass destruction. I won't repeat the long list of actions that Secretary Powell presented this morning in his excellent presentation. During the last decade, the challenges facing the intelligence community have grown more complex. Director Tennant will testify tomorrow and will provide a description of the challenges facing the intelligence community. We were concerned about the risk of surprise. In June of 2001, I attended the first NATO defense ministers meeting in the 21st century. I told my colleagues about Vice President Cheney's appearance before the Senate for his confirmation hearings as Secretary of Defense in March of 1989. During his hearings, a wide range of security issues were discussed, but not one person uttered the word Iraq. And yet, within a year, Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and that word was in every headline. I wondered what word might come to dominate my term in office that wasn't raised by members of the Senate committee during my hearings. 3 months later, we learned the answer: Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda. These were the kinds of threats that we were preparing to meet and deal with in the months before September 11th. And during those early months, we made progress in the effort to transform for the era of surprise and unconventional threats. Our actions included a congressionally required quadrennial defense review completed just days before the 9/11 attacks, where we laid out the transformation objectives of the department, identified as our first priority the defense of U.S. territory against a broad range of asymmetric threats, in short, homeland defense. We developed a concept for new defense planning guidance and new contingency planning guidance. We found that many, if not most, of the war plans that existed were in need of updating, and that the process for developing contingency plans was too lengthy. In May of 2001, we began the process of streamlining the way the department prepares war plans, reducing the time to develop plans and increasing the frequency at which the assumptions would be updated. I should add that for much of that period, most of the senior officials selected by the President had not been cleared or confirmed by the Senate. Nonetheless, the few new civilians and the many civilian officials who stayed on to help and the military leaders did a great deal of work. Indeed, because we were doing these things in the department, as well as in the National Security Council policy review, we were better prepared to respond when the 9/11 attack came. The day of September 11th, in the morning, I was hosting a meeting for some members of Congress, and I remember stressing how important it was for our country to be prepared for the unexpected. Shortly thereafter, someone handed me a note saying a plane had hit one of the World Trade Center towers. Shortly thereafter, I was in my office with a CIA briefer, and I was told that a second plane had hit the other tower. Shortly thereafter, at 9:38, the Pentagon shook with an explosion of then unknown origin. I went outside to determine what had happened. I was not there long because I was back in the Pentagon with the crisis action team shortly before or after 10 a.m. On my return from the crash site and before going to the Executive Support Center, I had one or more calls in my office, one of which was with the President. I went to the National Military Command Center where General Myers, who was the Vice Chairman of the Chiefs at that time, had just returned from Capitol Hill. We discussed, and I recommended raising the defense condition level from 5 to 3 and the force protection level. I joined the air threat telephone conference call that was already in progress, and one of the first exchanges was with the Vice President. He informed me of the President's authorization to shoot down hostile aircraft coming to Washington, D.C. My thoughts went to the pilots of the military aircraft who might be called upon to execute such an order. It was clear that they needed rules of engagement telling them what they could and could not do. They needed clarity. There were standing rules of engagement, but not rules of engagement that were appropriate for this first-time situation where civilian aircraft were seized and being used as missiles to attack inside the United States. It may well be the first time in history that U.S. armed forces in peacetime have been given the authority to fire on fellow Americans going about their lawful business. We went to work to refine the standing rules of engagement. I spent the remainder of the morning and the afternoon participating in the Air Threat Conference, talking to the President, the Vice President, General Myers, and others, and thinking about the way forward. During the course of the day, the President indicated he expected us to provide him with robust options for military responses to that attack. In my first weeks in office, I had prepared a list of guidelines to be weighed before committing U.S. forces to combat, and I shared them with the President back in January or February of 2001. The guidelines included a number of points, including one that if the proposed action truly necessary, if lives are going to be put at risk, there must be a darn good reason, and that all instruments of national power should be engaged before, during, and after any use of military force, and that it's important not to dumb down what's needed by promising not to do things, for example, by saying we won't use ground forces. A few days after September 11th, I wrote down some thoughts on terrorism and the new kind of war that had been visited upon us. I noted that it will take a sustained effort to root the terrorists out, that the campaign is a marathon, not a sprint, that no terrorist or terrorist network such as al-Qaeda is going to be conclusively dealt with by cruise missiles or bombers. The coalitions that are being fashioned will not be fixed, rather they'll change and evolve, and it should not be surprising that some countries will be supportive of some activities in which the U.S. is engaged, while other countries may not, and we can live with that. And this is not a war against Islam. The al-Qaeda terrorists are extremists whose views are antithetical to those of most Muslims. There are millions of Muslims around the world who we expect to become allies in this struggle, unquote. In the following days, we prepared options to deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan. The President issued an ultimatum to the Taliban. When they failed to comply, he initiated the global war on terror and directed the Department of Defense to carry out Operation Enduring Freedom against the al-Qaeda and their affiliates and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan that harbored and supported them. This, of course, was a Department of Defense where the armed forces of the United States had historically been organized, trained, and equipped to fight armies, navies, and air forces, not to chase down individual terrorists. In the aftermath of September 11th, the Department has pursued two tracks. We've prosecuted the global war on terror in concert with other agencies of the government and our coalition partners. But in addition, we've had to continue, and indeed accelerate the work to transform the Department so that it has the ability to meet and defeat the threats of the 21st century, different threats. There has been success on both fronts. The coalition has been successful in overthrowing two terrorist regimes, hunted down hundreds of terrorists and regime remnants, disrupted terrorist financing, disrupted terrorist cells on several continents. We've also established a Northern Command, a new command dedicated to defending the homeland. We've expanded the Special Operations Command in significant ways and given them additional authorities. Authorities they need today and will certainly need in the future. We've established a new Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense for the first time and an Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. The coalition's actions have sent a message to the world's terrorist states that harboring terrorists and the pursuit of weapons of mass murder carry with it unpleasant costs. By contrast, countries like Libya that abandon the support of terrorism and the pursuit of those weapons can find an open path to better relations with the world's free nations. In the period since September 11th, the administration, several committees of Congress, and now this commission have been examining what happened on that day. A number of questions have been raised. Some have asked, when the administration came into office, was there consideration of how to deal with the USS Cole? It's a fair question. One concern was that launching another cruise missile strike months after the fact might have sent a signal of weakness. Instead, we implemented the recommendations of the Cole Commission and began developing a more comprehensive approach to deal with al-Qaeda, resulting in NSPD-9. Some have asked, why wasn't bin Laden taken out? And if he had been hit, could it have prevented September 11th? I know of no actionable intelligence since January 20th that would have allowed the U.S. to capture or kill bin Laden. It took 10 months to capture Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and coalition forces had passed by the hole he was hiding in many, many times during those months. They were able to find him only after someone with specific knowledge told us precisely where he was. What that suggests, it seems to me, is that it's exceedingly difficult to find a single individual who is determined not to be found. Second, even if bin Laden had been captured or killed in the weeks before September 11th, no one I know believes that it would necessarily have prevented September 11th. Killing bin Laden would not have removed al-Qaeda's sanctuary in Afghanistan. Moreover, the sleeper cells that flew the aircraft into the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon were already in the United States months before the attack. Indeed, if actionable intelligence had appeared, which it did not, 9/11 would likely still have happened. And ironically, much of the world would likely have called the September 11th attack an al-Qaeda retaliation for the U.S. provocation of capturing or killing bin Laden. Some have asked whether there were plans to go after al-Qaeda in Afghanistan before 9/11, and if so, why weren't they successfully implemented? I've recently reviewed a briefing that I'm told was presented to me in early February briefing I saw was not something that I would characterize as a comprehensive plan with al-Qaeda, to deal with al-Qaeda and the sanctuary in Afghanistan. It was a series of concepts or approaches. I'm told that I asked the briefer many questions and that the team went back to work on refining it, and that the work they did in the ensuing months helped to prepare the department for the successful invasion of Afghanistan soon after September 11th. The NSC was at work during the spring and summer of 2001, developing the new counterterrorism policy needed to inform new war plans. And we were at the same time in the process of overhauling U.S. contingency plans. Some have asked, could the development of the armed predator have been accelerated? First, let me say that any suggestion that the predator was delayed by policy discussions or debates would be inaccurate. I know George Tenet plans to talk about this tomorrow, but I'm told that when the development plans were presented, it was estimated that it would take several years. They were presented, I believe, to General John Jumper in one of his previous posts. In fact, it was done in less than a year, and the armed predator was deployed and played a role in the success of Operation Enduring Freedom even before it had been officially certified as ready for development. I've been asked to make a few comments about the future. Today we face adversaries who take advantage of our open borders and our open societies to attack people. They hide in plain sight. They use institutions of everyday life, planes, trains, cars, letters, emails, as weapons to kill innocent civilians. And they can attack with handsfuls of people at a cost of a few hundred thousands of dollars, while it requires many tens of thousands of people and billions of dollars to defend against such attacks. Rooting out and dealing with terrorist enemies is tough. It will require that we think very differently than we did in the last century. The recommendations that this commission may make could help. For example, you might consider some of the following thoughts. How can we strengthen the intelligence community and get better arranged for the 21st century challenges? I've heard arguments in the wake of 9/11 that we need to consolidate all the intelligence agencies and put them under a single intelligence czar. In my view, that would be doing the country a great disservice. There are some activities, like intelligence and research and development, where it's a serious mistake to think that you're advantaged by relying on a single centralized source. In fact, fostering multiple centers of information has proven to be better at promoting creativity and challenging conventional thinking. There may be ways we can strengthen intelligence, but centralization is most certainly not one of them. A possibility might be to consider reducing stovepipes. It's true that the more people who know something, the more likely that that information will be compromised. We know that. It's a dilemma. There's a tension there. We need to weigh that risk of expanding access and thereby risking compromise against the danger of keeping information so tightly stovepiped that people who need to integrate it with other information are kept in the dark. I should add that it is increasingly difficult to distinguish between information that contributes to so-called national intelligence as opposed to information that is necessary for military intelligence and focuses on the battlefield. I would say that just as it would be unwise to concentrate everything under a single intelligence czar in an effort to improve national intelligence, it would be equally undesirable to concentrate everything under the Department of Defense so that one could improve military intelligence. It seems to me that either it would be an unfortunate approach. How can we wage war not just on terrorist networks, but also on the ideology of hate that they spread? The global war on terror will in fact be long. And I'm convinced that victory in the war on terror will require a positive effort as well as an aggressive battle. We need to find creative ways to stop the next generation of terrorists from being recruited, trained, and deployed to kill innocent people. For every terrorist that coalition forces capture or kill, still others are being recruited and trained. And to win the war on terror, we have to win the war of ideas, the battle for the minds of those who are being recruited and financed by terrorist networks across the globe. Can we transform the nomination and confirmation process so there are not long gaps with key positions unfilled every time there's a new administration? As I've indicated, for most of the 7 months leading up to September 11th, the department's work was done without many of the senior officials responsible for critical issues. We ought to consider whether in the 21st century we can afford the luxury of taking so long to put in place the senior officials for national security and try to fashion the necessary reforms to the clearance, nomination, and confirmation process. Another thought: could our nation benefit from a Goldwater-Nichols-like law for the executive branch of the U.S. government? If you think about it, the Goldwater-Nichols Act in the 1980s helped move Department of Defense towards a more effective joint approach to warfighting. It was a good thing. But to do so, each of the services had to give up some of their turf, some of their authorities. And today one could argue that the interagency process is such that the executive branch is stovepipe, much like the four services were 20 years ago, and ask the question, could we usefully apply that concept of the Goldwater-Nichols law to the government as a whole? Let me conclude by saying that despite the work of the coalition, terrorist attacks continue, most recently in Madrid. It's almost certain that in the period ahead, somewhere, more terrorist attacks will be attempted. What can be done? Not long ago, we marked the 20th anniversary of a terrorist attack in Beirut, Lebanon, when the suicide bomb truck attacked the Marine barracks, and that blast killed more than 240 Americans. Soon after that attack, President Reagan and Secretary of State Shultz asked me to serve as the Middle East envoy for a period. That experience taught me lessons about the nature of terrorism that are relevant today as we prosecute the global war on terror. After the attack, one seemingly logical response was to put a cement barricade around the buildings to prevent more truck bombings. A very logical thing to do. And it had the effect of preventing more truck bombings. But the terrorists very quickly figured out how to get around those barricades, and they began lobbing rocket-propelled grenades over the cement barricades. And the reaction then was to hunker down even more, and they started seeing buildings along the corniche that runs along the sea in Beirut, draped with metal wire mesh coming down from several stories high, so that when rocket-propelled grenades hit the mesh, they would bounce off, doing little damage. It worked, again, but only briefly.
But he has skipped some of
And the terrorists again adapted. They watched the comings and goings of embassy personnel and began hitting soft targets. They killed people on their way to and from work. So for every defense, first barricades, then wire mesh, the terrorists moved to another avenue of attack. One has to note that the terrorists had learned important lessons. That terrorism is a great equalizer, it's a force multiplier, it's cheap, it's deniable, it yields substantial results, it's low risk, and it's often without penalty. They had learned that a single attack, by influencing public opinion and morale, can alter the behavior of great nations. Moreover, I said that free people had learned lessons as well. That terrorism is a form of warfare that must be treated as such. Simply standing in a defensive position, absorbing blows, is not enough. It has to be attacked and it has to be deterred. That was 20 years ago. When our nation was attacked on September 11th, the President recognized what had happened as an act of war and that it must be treated as such, not a law enforcement matter. He knew that weakness would only invite aggression, and that the only way to defeat terrorists was to take the war to them and to make clear to states that sponsor and harbor them that such actions would have consequences. That's why we have forces risking their lives fighting terrorists today. And to live as free people in the 21st century, we cannot think that we can hide behind concrete barriers or wire mesh. We cannot think that acquiescence or trying to make a separate peace with terrorists, to leave us alone, but to go after our friends, will work. Free people cannot live in fear and remain free. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.